Have you ever wondered if the Bible is hiding secrets about the true origins of humanity? What if the Hebrew text reveals shocking details about Eve that most people have never noticed? In this video, we dive deep into the Ethiopian Bible and uncover surprising evidence suggesting a connection between Eve and Africa. Get ready to explore hidden passages, ancient manuscripts, and interpretations that could change everything you thought you knew about the first woman. This is a journey into history, mystery, and revelation you won't want to miss. Have you ever wondered why Ethiopia, one of the oldest civilizations on Earth, appears repeatedly in ancient stories and biblical references, and what this could mean for the origins of humanity? To understand the surprising connection between Eve and Ethiopia, we first need to explore the historical and geographical context of this remarkable region, because without it, the hidden clues in the Hebrew texts lose much of their significance. Ethiopia is not just a distant land. It is a cradle of culture, spirituality, and human history that played a vital role in the ancient world. Ethiopia's history stretches back thousands of years, long before many of the civilizations we often associate with the biblical era. It was home to powerful kingdoms like DMT and Aksum, centers of trade, culture, and religion. Its strategic location in the Horn of Africa made it a crossroads for commerce and ideas, connecting Africa with the Middle East and the Mediterranean. This connectivity is crucial because it suggests that the region was not isolated. Rather, it was deeply intertwined with the world described in the Hebrew Bible. The ancient Hebrews would have been aware of Ethiopia, or Cush as it was often called, through trade networks and migration patterns. In the Bible, Ethiopia appears under several names, including Cush and Nubia, and these references are not merely decorative. They indicate a real awareness of lands far to the south and hint at interactions between ancient Hebrews and African peoples. Some of these mentions occur in genealogies, describing the descendants of Noah and their migrations, while others appear in narratives of kings, nations, and divine interventions. The presence of these names in Hebrew texts raises an intriguing possibility. Could the biblical authors have known enough about these regions to link them to the story of humanity's earliest figures, including Eve? Understanding Ethiopia's geography is also essential. The land is characterized by fertile highlands, river valleys, and a climate conducive to agriculture and early settlement. Many scholars believe that the descriptions of lush, life-giving lands in biblical texts could correspond to these real places. In the Hebrew Bible, words like Adamah, meaning earth or ground, are used to describe where humans come from, suggesting a tangible, life-sustaining environment. Ethiopia's natural richness fits this description perfectly, making it a plausible candidate for the type of land envisioned in the early narratives of human origins. Beyond geography, Ethiopia's culture and political history provide further context. The Kingdom of Aksum, for example, was a sophisticated empire with its own script, coins, and international trade. Such civilizations would have been known to the peoples of the ancient Near East, and it is not unreasonable to think that knowledge about these lands could have influenced the Hebrew authors. The connection between Ethiopia and biblical events is further strengthened by the country's long-standing religious traditions, including the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, which preserves ancient manuscripts collectively referred to as the Ethiopian Bible. These texts often contain unique versions of stories about Adam, Eve, and their descendants, offering details absent from other translations. The transmission of Hebrew texts is another important factor. The Hebrew Bible was meticulously copied over centuries, but in translation, nuances and geographic references were sometimes lost or generalized. When the texts were rendered into Greek, Latin, or other languages, subtle hints about places like Ethiopia could have been overlooked or omitted. This makes the original Hebrew manuscripts, as well as the Ethiopian versions, particularly valuable for researchers who aim to uncover hidden meanings and historical contexts. The suggestion that Eve could be connected to Africa is not arbitrary. It emerges from careful linguistic analysis and comparison between these ancient sources. Ethiopia also has a rich tradition of oral history that complements written texts. Before the codification of manuscripts, stories of human origins were passed down through generations orally, often preserving geographical and cultural details that might otherwise have been forgotten. These oral traditions describe fertile lands, rivers, and mountains, which scholars have linked to the Ethiopian landscape. By combining these narratives with the Hebrew texts, researchers can piece together a picture that situates early humanity in a very real, tangible place rather than a purely symbolic garden. Trade and cultural exchange further reinforce this connection. Ethiopia's location near the Red Sea and along major trade routes made it a hub of interaction with Egypt, the Levant, and Arabia. These contacts likely facilitated the transmission of knowledge about geography, people, and natural resources. When we read Hebrew texts describing distant lands, rivers, and fertile regions, it is plausible that some of these references were informed by knowledge of Northeast Africa. This suggests that the biblical authors had more than just a symbolic understanding of the world. They incorporated real-world observations into their narratives. The religious context is equally important. Ethiopia has a unique place in biblical history, with traditions linking it to figures such as the Queen of Sheba and other early leaders. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church preserves texts that expand upon the Genesis story, sometimes including genealogies, geographic markers, and cultural references that are absent from Western translations. These manuscripts suggest that early interpretations of Adam and Eve might have envisioned them living in or connected to lands in Africa. This does not contradict the spiritual message of the Bible, but rather enriches our understanding by situating it within a real-world context. Language plays a crucial role in uncovering these connections. Hebrew is a language rich in meaning, where words often carry multiple layers of significance. Terms describing the earth, fertility, and life may also encode hints about specific regions. When scholars compare these Hebrew terms with Ethiopian texts and oral traditions, patterns emerge that suggest an African setting for parts of the Genesis narrative. For example, the repeated emphasis on life-giving land, rivers, and abundance resonates strongly with the fertile regions of Ethiopia, supporting the hypothesis that the biblical story has both spiritual and geographic dimensions. Finally, understanding the historical and geographical context of Ethiopia helps us appreciate why researchers consider it significant in the story of Eve. Its long history, fertile land, cultural richness, and integration into trade and communication networks make it a plausible location for the early narratives of humanity. Combined with linguistic clues, manuscript evidence, and oral traditions, Ethiopia emerges as more than a backdrop. It could be a central element in understanding the origins of the first humans as described in ancient texts. In conclusion, Ethiopia is not just a distant country mentioned in passing. It is a key to unlocking hidden layers in the biblical story of Eve. Its geography, history, culture, and religious traditions provide context that helps explain why some scholars believe the first woman might be linked to this region. The combination of Hebrew text analysis, Ethiopian manuscripts, and historical geography allows us to see the Genesis story in a new light, where ancient narratives and real-world locations intersect. By understanding Ethiopia's significance, we take the first crucial step in uncovering the shocking truths hidden in the Hebrew texts about Eve's origin, setting the stage for a deeper exploration of evidence, interpretations, and controversies that will follow in the next sections of this video. Have you ever wondered if the Hebrew text of the Bible might be hiding secrets about the true origin of humanity that most translations have overlooked? What if the story of Eve contains clues pointing to Africa, specifically Ethiopia, that have been preserved in ancient manuscripts but ignored for centuries? In this section, we are going to dive deep into the Hebrew text of Genesis, analyze keywords, names, and phrases, and uncover why some scholars believe the Bible itself may be hinting at a connection between Eve and Ethiopia. To begin, it's essential to understand that the Hebrew text is far more than a simple story. It is a carefully constructed work where every word, name, and root can carry multiple layers of meaning. Take the term Adam, for instance. While it is commonly translated as man or human, its root in Hebrew, Adamah, literally means ground or earth. This implies a direct link between humans and the fertile land from which they come. Some researchers suggest that these linguistic roots could also encode geographical information, pointing toward specific regions known for their fertility and life-giving properties. Ethiopia, with its rich soils, rivers, and highlands, matches this description remarkably well, offering a plausible connection between the biblical narrative and the African continent. Then there is the name Eve, or Chava in Hebrew, meaning life, or the one who gives life. While this seems straightforward at first glance, a closer look at the original Hebrew text shows that Chava may also have connotations beyond mere symbolism. Certain linguistic patterns in the text associate life and fertility with geographic abundance, rivers, and lands that sustain human settlement. Scholars argue that the life-giving aspect of Eve could be referencing not just her role as the mother of humanity, but also a fertile region in Northeast Africa, reinforcing a potential link to Ethiopia. Another critical element is the genealogies found in Genesis. On the surface, they appear to be simple lists of names tracing human lineage. However, a closer analysis of the Hebrew roots behind these names reveals semantic patterns that connect to fertility, abundance, and even geographic locations. When these genealogies are compared to Ethiopian oral traditions and manuscripts, striking parallels emerge. Some of the descendants listed in the texts are linked, through meaning or interpretation, to rivers, fertile valleys, and lands consistent with the Ethiopian landscape. This suggests that the biblical authors may have incorporated real-world geography into their accounts, embedding subtle references to Africa in a way that most modern readers fail to notice. The transmission of Hebrew texts over the centuries adds another layer of complexity. While the scribes were meticulous in copying manuscripts, translations into Greek, Latin, and later languages often simplified or omitted nuanced references to places and meanings. Words that could hint at an African origin were sometimes rendered generically, stripping away the subtle geographic cues that might have been obvious to an ancient audience familiar with these lands. This is one reason why the Ethiopian manuscripts, preserved by the Orthodox Church of Ethiopia, are so valuable. They retain interpretations and details that may have been lost in Western translations, offering a window into how early communities understood the story of Eve in a geographic and cultural context. Rivers and land descriptions in the Hebrew text also support this connection. The Garden of Eden is described as being watered by 4 rivers. While interpretations vary, some scholars propose that these rivers correspond symbolically or literally to major water systems in northeast Africa, including the Nile and its tributaries. The text uses Hebrew terms that describe abundance, fertility, and life-giving water, which closely align with the characteristics of Ethiopia's highlands and river valleys. By reading these descriptions with an eye toward geography, the narrative begins to point to a real, physical location rather than a purely mythical or symbolic one. Furthermore, the Ethiopian Bible preserves details about the first humans that are absent from Western translations. Manuscripts include elaborations on Adam and Eve's lives, their descendants, and the lands they inhabited, often specifying regions that align with Ethiopian and nearby African territories. While some scholars argue these are later additions influenced by local culture, others see them as a continuation of an ancient tradition that may have been part of the original Hebrew understanding. The overlap between the Hebrew roots, geographic hints, and Ethiopian traditions suggests a continuity of knowledge that strengthens the argument for an African connection. Language analysis provides additional insight. Hebrew is rich in symbolism, and words often have multiple layers of meaning. When researchers examine the roots associated with life, fertility, and the first humans, connections emerge between these words and terms used in Ethiopian texts. For example, names that denote abundance, water, or life can correspond both to a person and to a land. This dual meaning is a hallmark of Hebrew writing and indicates that the text could be simultaneously spiritual, symbolic, and geographic. Such linguistic richness allows for the possibility that Eve is portrayed not only as the mother of humanity but also as connected to a specific life-giving region, potentially Ethiopia. Oral traditions also play a crucial role. Before the stories were codified in manuscripts, they were passed down orally for generations. Oral transmission often preserves local knowledge about geography, resources, and culture. In Ethiopia, oral histories of Adam and Eve include references to rivers, fertile lands, and specific locations that correlate with the Hebrew text. By considering these oral traditions alongside the written manuscripts, we gain a fuller picture of how early communities understood the story and its setting. This combination of oral and written evidence suggests that the authors were aware of real-world geography when crafting the narrative. Trade and cultural exchange between Ethiopia and the ancient Near East further reinforce this connection. Ethiopia's proximity to Egypt, the Red Sea, and major trade routes made it a hub of interaction. Knowledge about the land, its resources, and its people would have circulated among merchants, travelers, and scholars. Hebrew authors may have incorporated some of this knowledge into their writings, encoding it in genealogies, names, and descriptions of the land. When we read the Hebrew text with attention to these details, it becomes plausible that the narrative includes subtle references to Ethiopia. Theologically, this interpretation does not undermine the spiritual significance of Eve. Instead, it enriches our understanding. If Eve is connected to Ethiopia, it emphasizes the universality of humanity and highlights Africa's central role in human history. It also challenges the Eurocentric interpretations that have dominated biblical scholarship for centuries, opening the door to a more inclusive and historically informed perspective. Recognizing Ethiopia's potential role in the Genesis narrative allows us to appreciate the Bible as a document that reflects both spiritual truths and knowledge of the physical world. Finally, the The textual analysis suggests that the story of Eve is multidimensional. She is a spiritual figure, a mother of humanity, and potentially a representation of life emerging from a specific fertile region. The Hebrew text, with its layered meanings and careful word choices, combined with Ethiopian manuscripts and oral traditions, provides a compelling case for revisiting our assumptions about the origins of humanity. It encourages scholars and curious readers alike to consider both the symbolic and geographic dimensions of the Bible, revealing a story that is richer, more complex, and far more fascinating than commonly understood. In conclusion, the Hebrew text of Genesis, when studied alongside Ethiopian manuscripts and traditions, reveals hidden layers that point to a possible African connection for Eve. Names, linguistic roots, genealogies, rivers, and references to fertile lands suggest that the biblical authors had a sophisticated understanding of geography and life, potentially linking the first humans to Ethiopia. This analysis not only challenges traditional interpretations but also invites us to explore the Bible with fresh eyes, appreciating its depth, complexity, and the hidden clues that have been preserved for millennia. The next section will focus on the specific evidence in the Ethiopian Bible that directly connects Eve to Ethiopia, examining passages, names, and locations in detail to show how these texts preserve ancient knowledge that has been overlooked by most scholars and translators for centuries. Have you ever wondered what secrets the Ethiopian Bible might be hiding about the origins of Eve that the mainstream translations of the Bible never reveal? While most people are familiar with the stories of Adam and Eve as presented in Western translations, the Ethiopian manuscripts preserve details that could change our understanding of the first woman and her connection to Africa. In this section, we will examine the evidence in the Ethiopian Bible, exploring passages, genealogies, and geographic references that suggest a profound link between Eve and Ethiopia, a connection that has been largely overlooked for centuries. To begin, it's important to understand what makes the Ethiopian Bible unique. Unlike Western versions, which often simplify or condense narratives, the Ethiopian manuscripts include additional books, genealogical records, and expanded narratives that preserve interpretations lost in translation. These texts were carefully maintained by the Ethiopian Orthodox Church over centuries, ensuring that oral traditions, cultural context, and ancient knowledge were not entirely erased. What is particularly fascinating is how these manuscripts describe the first humans in ways that suggest real locations, not merely symbolic or metaphorical spaces. Rivers, fertile lands, mountains, and settlements are frequently mentioned, creating a vivid backdrop for the Genesis story that aligns closely with the Ethiopian landscape. One of the most compelling pieces of evidence comes from genealogies preserved in the Ethiopian Bible. While the Hebrew text lists the descendants of Adam and Eve in a straightforward manner, the Ethiopian manuscripts provide additional details about the lands and regions associated with these descendants. Many of these regions correspond to areas in northeast Africa, particularly Ethiopia and the surrounding highlands. For example, certain names in the genealogical lists are linked to rivers, fertile valleys, or settlements known in Ethiopian tradition. This suggests that the authors were encoding geographical knowledge into the narrative, using names and lineage to hint at a physical connection between the first humans and Africa. Beyond genealogies, the text includes descriptions of the environment where Adam and Eve lived. The Garden of Eden, while often interpreted symbolically, is depicted with references to rivers and fertile lands that resemble the Ethiopian highlands and river systems. Scholars have noted that the Hebrew word Adamah, meaning fertile ground or earth, could have specific resonance with a land known for its abundance. The Ethiopian Bible takes these descriptions further, explicitly connecting life-giving rivers and fertile valleys to regions that match Ethiopia's geography. This interpretation transforms the story from a purely spiritual allegory into a narrative grounded in real-world landscapes. Language and semantics provide another layer of evidence. In Hebrew, many names and words are symbolic but can also reference specific locations. The Ethiopian Bible preserves these nuances while also expanding upon them, often offering explanations or contextual clues that were lost in Western translations. For example, Eve's name, Chava, meaning life, is not only a symbolic reference to her role as the mother of humanity but is also associated with fertile, life-sustaining land. In combination with the Ethiopian context, this dual meaning reinforces the idea that Eve's story may have roots in a specific region of Africa, rather than being entirely abstract or allegorical. Oral traditions in Ethiopia further strengthen this connection. Before these manuscripts were written down, stories about Adam, Eve, and their descendants were passed down orally through generations. These oral histories often include detailed descriptions of rivers, mountains, and fertile lands, which align with the regions described in the Ethiopian Bible. The convergence of written manuscripts and oral tradition suggests that early Ethiopian communities retained knowledge about the origins of humanity that was geographically informed, pointing to a direct link between the biblical narrative and the African continent. The Ethiopian Bible also provides expanded narratives about the migration of Adam and Eve's descendants. While Western translations often leave the movements of these early humans vague, the Ethiopian manuscripts detail journeys across specific lands, many of which are consistent with areas in Ethiopia and neighboring regions. Rivers, hills, and fertile valleys are frequently mentioned as landmarks, suggesting that the story was intended to situate humanity in a tangible, real-world setting. This geographical anchoring adds depth to the narrative, showing that the first humans were not simply symbolic figures but part of a broader story of human settlement and development in Africa. Religious and cultural context is also essential. Ethiopia has a long tradition of linking itself to biblical history. Figures such as the Queen of Sheba and her interactions with King Solomon are central to Ethiopian heritage, and these stories are preserved in the same manuscripts that contain expanded Genesis narratives. The connection between Eve and Ethiopia fits within this broader pattern of linking biblical figures to African lands, highlighting Ethiopia's significance in early biblical interpretation. These texts suggest that Ethiopian communities understood themselves as custodians of ancient knowledge, preserving interpretations that emphasize Africa's central role in the story of humanity. The Ethiopian Bible also provides insight into how early communities interpreted the symbolic aspects of the Genesis story in relation to geography. For example, the concept of life-giving rivers and fertile land is often intertwined with spiritual lessons about creation, abundance, and divine providence. By situating these symbolic elements in actual landscapes, the manuscripts create a layered narrative that merges the spiritual and the physical. This dual approach suggests that the biblical authors, or at least the communities preserving these texts, were deeply aware of the world around them and sought to connect human origins to a real, life-sustaining environment. Comparisons between Hebrew texts and Ethiopian manuscripts reveal fascinating parallels and divergences. Some passages in the Ethiopian texts retain Hebrew roots, names, and wordplay that have been simplified or lost in Western translations. For instance, genealogical names that denote life, fertility, or water correspond to regions and landscapes in Ethiopia. This overlap is not coincidental. It reflects a continuity of knowledge across languages, cultures, and centuries. Scholars studying these connections argue that the Ethiopian manuscripts preserve a layer of meaning about Eve and human origins that has been obscured in more widely read translations. The Ethiopian manuscripts also highlight the role of women in these early narratives. Eve is not only the mother of humanity but is portrayed as central to the establishment of human society in the fertile lands described in the texts. She is linked to life, fertility, and the nurturing of the first communities, emphasizing a tangible, earthly dimension to her role. This contrasts with some Western interpretations that focus primarily on moral or theological lessons, underscoring the importance of cultural perspective in understanding biblical narratives. Finally, the Ethiopian Bible challenges us to reconsider how we approach the study of the Bible. By incorporating geography, linguistics, oral tradition, and manuscript evidence, it provides a richer, more nuanced understanding of human origins. It shows that ancient communities saw connections between spiritual truths and the physical world, encoding knowledge about life, land, and human beginnings into the stories of Adam and Eve. The evidence in these manuscripts supports the possibility that Eve's story is not only symbolic but also linked to a real region of Africa, providing a fascinating alternative perspective on a narrative that has shaped human thought for millennia. In conclusion, the Ethiopian Bible offers compelling evidence that Eve may have a connection to Ethiopia, preserved through genealogies, geographic descriptions, and linguistic cues. Rivers, fertile lands, and migration patterns described in the manuscripts align with Ethiopian geography, while oral traditions reinforce this connection. The manuscripts show that early Ethiopian communities preserved a detailed and geographically informed interpretation of the Genesis story, highlighting Africa's central role in human origins. By examining these texts closely, we uncover a narrative that is both spiritual and grounded in reality, challenging Western-centric interpretations and offering a fresh perspective on one of humanity's oldest and most influential stories. Have you ever wondered why the idea that Eve might have an African origin sparks such intense debate among scholars, theologians, and historians? The Ethiopian Bible presents evidence that challenges conventional interpretations of Genesis, suggesting that Eve may have a connection to Ethiopia, a perspective rarely discussed in mainstream biblical studies. In this section, we will explore the interpretations and controversies surrounding these findings, examining why some experts embrace this theory while others remain skeptical, and what it tells us about the way we read, translate, and understand ancient texts. The controversy begins with the Hebrew text itself. Traditional translations often simplify the narrative, leaving out details that may hint at specific locations or cultural contexts. Words, names, and genealogies carry nuanced meanings in the original Hebrew, and when these subtleties are lost in translation, readers miss critical layers of information. For example, the Hebrew word Adamah refers to fertile ground or soil, which some scholars argue could correspond to real-world locations, potentially in northeast Africa. Similarly, the name Eve or Chava, meaning life, has linguistic and symbolic connections to fertility and abundance that some researchers believe point to a region like Ethiopia. These linguistic clues, when combined with Ethiopian manuscripts, suggest a layered understanding of the text that goes beyond a purely symbolic reading. Some scholars argue that the Ethiopian Bible preserves ancient traditions that were lost or altered in Western translations. These manuscripts include additional genealogical details, place names, and environmental descriptions that provide context for the story of Adam and Eve. The inclusion of rivers, fertile valleys, and geographic markers is not present in many mainstream Bibles, leading researchers to believe that the Ethiopian texts offer a more historically grounded interpretation. This creates a tension between traditional biblical scholarship, which often emphasizes theological or moral lessons, and newer interpretations that prioritize historical and geographic accuracy. Critics, however, raise important objections. They argue that the Ethiopian Bible contains additions influenced by local culture and tradition, rather than being faithful reproductions of an original Hebrew text. From this perspective, the connection between Eve and Ethiopia could be seen as a cultural interpolation, reflecting the Ethiopian community's desire to situate biblical figures within their own landscape. This raises a crucial question. How can we distinguish between original elements of the Hebrew narrative and later additions? Scholars use linguistic analysis, cross-referencing with Hebrew roots, and comparison with other manuscripts to determine which details are likely authentic and which may have been influenced by local context. Theological debates also play a significant role in this controversy. Many religious scholars caution against reading the Genesis story as literal geography. From this perspective, Eve's story is a spiritual and moral narrative, and attempting to tie her to a specific location risks reducing a sacred text to historical geography. Supporters of the African origin theory respond by saying that recognizing Ethiopia's potential role does not diminish the story's spiritual significance. Instead, it enriches our understanding by placing the narrative in a concrete, life-sustaining environment. This debate highlights a broader tension between symbolic interpretation and historical or geographic analysis, which has been central to biblical scholarship for centuries. Cultural and racial implications add another layer of complexity. The traditional Western reading of Genesis often abstracts humanity's origins from Africa, despite overwhelming archaeological and anthropological evidence pointing to Africa as the cradle of human life. The Ethiopian Bible's interpretation challenges this tendency, reconnecting humanity's biblical origins with Africa. This has led to passionate debates, as it intersects with issues of identity, representation, and the historical marginalization of African contributions to human history. Some scholars see this as an opportunity to correct Eurocentric biases, while others view it as speculative or politically motivated. Another source of controversy is the integration of oral traditions. Ethiopian communities have preserved oral histories that align with the manuscripts, describing rivers, fertile lands, and settlements associated with Adam, Eve, and their descendants. While these oral traditions provide valuable context, critics argue that oral narratives can evolve over time, incorporating local legends and mythic elements. The challenge for scholars is to determine how much of the oral tradition reflects ancient knowledge preserved from Hebrew sources, and how much is a creative adaptation by later communities. This balance between preservation and adaptation lies at the heart of the debate. Archaeological and historical evidence further complicates the discussion. Ethiopia and the surrounding regions are rich in early human history, with some of the oldest known hominid fossils and evidence of early human settlements. Proponents of the African origin theory argue that this aligns with the biblical narrative, supporting the idea that the story of Eve may reflect a collective memory of humanity's early presence in Africa. Critics counter that correlating biblical genealogies with archaeological evidence is speculative, as the Bible is not intended as a scientific record of human evolution. Nonetheless, the overlap between textual clues, oral tradition, and African history makes the discussion compelling and worthy of serious scholarly attention. Interpretations also vary based on religious tradition. Ethiopian Orthodox scholars often embrace the African origin theory, seeing it as a confirmation of their cultural and spiritual heritage. Western scholars may be more cautious, emphasizing textual criticism and theological tradition over geographic speculation. This divergence illustrates how interpretations are shaped not only by evidence but also by cultural and institutional perspectives. Understanding these differences is key to grasping why the topic remains controversial and why it sparks passionate debate among experts and the public alike. One particularly interesting point of debate is the symbolic versus literal reading of geographic references. Rivers, fertile valleys, and highlands in the Ethiopia Bible could be interpreted symbolically, representing life, abundance, and divine provision, rather than specific places. Supporters of the African origin interpretation argue that the symbolic and literal readings are not mutually exclusive. The authors may have used real-world geography to reinforce spiritual lessons, embedding multiple layers of meaning in the text. Critics caution that reading these passages as literal geography risks projecting modern understandings onto ancient narratives. The debate also extends to language and translation. Hebrew words often carry multiple meanings, and subtle nuances can be lost or altered in translation. The Ethiopia Bible preserves certain linguistic patterns that hint at geographic and environmental features, which are absent in many Western translations. This suggests that early communities understood the text in a context that combined spiritual, cultural, and geographic knowledge. The controversy arises when scholars disagree on how to interpret these patterns, with some seeing them as clear evidence of an African connection and others viewing them as ambiguous or symbolic. Finally, the broader implications of this debate are profound. If Eve is indeed connected to Ethiopia, it challenges long-held assumptions about human origins in biblical narratives. It encourages scholars, theologians, and readers to reconsider the historical and geographic context of the Genesis story, while also highlighting Africa's central role in the story of humanity. It also demonstrates how interpretation, translation, and cultural perspective shape the way we understand ancient texts, reminding us that the Bible is a living document whose meaning can expand and evolve over time. In conclusion, the interpretations and controversies surrounding Eve's potential connection to Ethiopia are complex and multifaceted. Linguistic analysis, manuscript evidence, oral tradition, geography, archaeology, and theology all contribute to the discussion, creating a rich tapestry of perspectives. Supporters argue that the Ethiopia Bible preserves a unique understanding of humanity's beginnings, linking Eve to a fertile, life-giving region in Africa, while critics caution against overreaching conclusions or conflating symbolism with literal geography. The debate highlights the dynamic interplay between text, culture, and interpretation, revealing that our understanding of the Genesis story is far from fixed. In the next section, we will examine the cultural and religious implications of connecting Eve to Ethiopia, exploring how these interpretations have influenced Ethiopian traditions, African identity, and global perspectives on biblical history. We will see how this theory resonates beyond the academic sphere, affecting faith, heritage, and the way communities around the world relate to the story of humanity's first woman. Have you ever wondered how the story of Eve's possible African origin could shape culture, religion, and identity, not just in Ethiopia, but across the world? The Ethiopia Bible does more than preserve ancient narratives. It connects humanity's earliest story to a rich and vibrant culture, offering insights that challenge conventional interpretations and inspire new ways of thinking about faith and history. In this section, we will explore the cultural and religious implications of linking Eve to Ethiopia, examining how this interpretation has influenced traditions, belief systems, and global perceptions of human origins. To begin, the Ethiopian Orthodox Church plays a central role in preserving these narratives. For centuries, Ethiopian monks and scholars meticulously copied manuscripts, ensuring that the stories of Adam, Eve, and their descendants were passed down through generations. Unlike Western translations, which often condensed or altered the text, Ethiopian manuscripts provide expanded accounts, including genealogies, geographic details, and environmental descriptions that point to Ethiopia. These texts are not merely religious documents. They are cultural artifacts that reflect the worldview, history, and spiritual understanding of a people who have long seen themselves as connected to the earliest chapters of human history. One of the most profound cultural implications is the affirmation of Africa's role in human origins. In Western-centric narratives, the biblical story often abstracts humanity from its African roots, portraying Adam and Eve as universal figures without geographic context. The Ethiopia Bible, however, situates the narrative in a recognizable African landscape, emphasizing Ethiopia as a life-giving land. This has deep significance for identity and heritage, particularly for African communities seeking to reconnect with a historical narrative that includes them at the center rather than the periphery. The possibility that Eve originated in Africa transforms the biblical story from a universal, abstract tale into one grounded in real human history, elevating Africa's role in the shared story of humanity. Religious interpretations are equally affected. By linking Eve to Ethiopia, the narrative highlights the universality of human life while simultaneously rooting spiritual lessons in tangible geography. For Ethiopian Christians, this connection reinforces a sense of sacred history within their own land. The rivers, valleys, and highlands described in the manuscripts are more than mere settings. They are sacred spaces where the story of humanity unfolded. This geographic grounding enriches spiritual practice, creating a profound connection between faith, land, and community. It also encourages believers to consider the physical world as part of God's creation in a more immediate and tangible way. The implications extend beyond Ethiopia itself. When we recognize that the earliest humans might have been connected to Africa, it challenges long-held Eurocentric interpretations of biblical history. It invites theologians, historians, and ordinary readers worldwide to reconsider assumptions about the origins of humanity and the dissemination of biblical narratives. This broader perspective emphasizes interconnectedness, highlighting how knowledge, trade, and cultural exchange in the ancient world shaped the stories that would become central to Jewish, Christian, and Islamic traditions. It also opens the door for a more inclusive interpretation of the Bible, one that recognizes multiple cultural and geographic contributions to its narratives. Cultural identity is deeply tied to these interpretations. For centuries, African communities have grappled with narratives that marginalize their role in human history. The Ethiopian Bible offers a counter-narrative, asserting that Africa is not a backdrop but a central stage in the story of humanity. This has profound implications for education, heritage, and self-perception. By situating Eve and the beginnings of humanity in Ethiopia, communities can reclaim a sense of pride and belonging in global history. It shifts the focus from external validation to an internal acknowledgement of Africa's foundational contributions to human civilization. Art and literature have also been influenced by this interpretation. Ethiopian manuscripts often depict Adam and Eve within the context of African landscapes, using visual cues and narrative details that reflect local geography and culture. These representations provide a powerful counterpoint to Western artistic traditions, offering alternative ways of imagining biblical events. Beyond Ethiopia, artists and writers exploring African-centered interpretations of Genesis have drawn inspiration from these manuscripts, producing works that blend theology, history, and cultural pride. This demonstrates how textual interpretation can ripple outward, influencing broader cultural production and shaping collective imagination. Another significant implication involves the perception of women in religious and cultural contexts. In the Ethiopian Bible, Eve is not only a symbolic figure but also a central agent in establishing life and community in a fertile, real-world setting. She embodies both spiritual and earthly life, bridging the divine and human spheres. This duality emphasizes the importance of women as both literal and symbolic progenitors, reinforcing her centrality in religious thought while grounding her story in tangible geography. By portraying Eve in this multifaceted way, the Ethiopian tradition provides a richer and more empowering understanding of her role in human history. The intersection of geography, culture, and religion also has educational significance. Studying the Ethiopian Bible encourages learners to think critically about the origins of texts, the impact of translation, and the ways in which culture shapes interpretation. It challenges readers to consider multiple perspectives, from linguistic analysis of Hebrew roots to the preservation of oral traditions and manuscript culture in Ethiopia. This interdisciplinary approach fosters a deeper understanding of history, religion, and human diversity, encouraging students and enthusiasts alike to appreciate the complexity of biblical narratives beyond simplified translations. Controversy and debate further highlight the cultural stakes. Some scholars dismiss the Ethiopian connection as speculative, arguing that geographic references are symbolic or culturally interpolated. Others embrace it, seeing it as a valuable corrective to centuries of Eurocentric biblical interpretation. This ongoing dialogue underscores the importance of context in understanding sacred texts. By engaging with these debates, audiences gain insight into the dynamic nature of scholarship and the ways in which interpretation can shape identity, belief, and cultural pride. The Ethiopian Bible also has implications for interfaith dialogue. Judaism, Christianity, and Islam share narratives about Adam and Eve, yet their interpretations often differ. The Ethiopian perspective introduces a shared geographic and historical dimension that can enrich conversations between faiths. By situating the origin story in Africa, scholars and religious communities can explore common ground while acknowledging the diversity of interpretation. This approach encourages respect for multiple traditions and emphasizes the global dimensions of biblical storytelling. Finally, these cultural and religious implications demonstrate the enduring relevance of ancient texts. The story of Eve is not merely a distant myth, it intersects with issues of identity, heritage, and understanding of the world. Linking Eve to Ethiopia allows us to see the Bible not as a static document, but as a living source of knowledge and inspiration. It challenges readers to question assumptions, consider alternative perspectives, and engage with history in a meaningful way. By grounding spiritual narratives in real-world geography and culture, the Ethiopia Bible enriches our understanding of humanity's past while offering lessons that resonate today. In conclusion, the Ethiopia Bible's interpretation of Eve as connected to Africa carries profound cultural and religious significance. It affirms Africa's central role in human origins, enriches religious understanding by connecting spiritual narratives to real-world geography, and provides communities with a sense of historical and cultural pride. This perspective challenges Eurocentric assumptions, broadens educational and artistic horizons, and fosters dialogue across faiths and cultures. By exploring these implications, we see that the story of Eve is not only about the first woman but also about the connection between humanity, land, and culture, highlighting Ethiopia's pivotal role in the shared history of our species. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss more content like this. That way, you'll always be up to date with our upcoming videos. Now, let's keep going. Have you ever wondered how the story of Eve's African origin could change the way we see the world today? It might sound like ancient history, but the implications of connecting Eve to Ethiopia reach far beyond theology or biblical scholarship. In this section, we're going to explore the modern relevance of this theory, showing how it influences contemporary discussions about identity, history, religion, and even the way we understand humanity's shared past. First, let's consider identity. For centuries, Africa has often been marginalized in global narratives about human history, with Western interpretations of the Bible and science largely ignoring the continent's central role. By situating Eve in Ethiopia, the narrative reclaims Africa's place in the story of humanity. This isn't just symbolic, it has tangible cultural and psychological significance. For African communities and the diaspora, the idea that the first woman, the mother of all humans, has roots in Ethiopia can foster pride, belonging, and a renewed connection to ancestral history. It challenges centuries of narratives that have excluded or minimized African contributions to civilization, and it provides a powerful framework for understanding humanity's origins in a way that includes Africa at its core. This perspective also reshapes conversations about religion. Many people assume that biblical narratives are purely spiritual or symbolic, disconnected from geography or history. The Ethiopia Bible challenges that assumption, suggesting that the first humans may have lived in a specific, life-giving environment in Africa. This interpretation encourages modern believers to think about faith in a more grounded, interconnected way, linking spiritual lessons to the natural world and to real historical contexts. For theologians, it opens new avenues of interpretation, inviting discussions about how geography, culture, and history interact with sacred texts. The impact extends to education and scholarship. By highlighting Ethiopia as a potential origin point for Eve, educators and historians can broaden discussions about human history and biblical studies. Students are encouraged to look beyond Eurocentric frameworks and explore a more diverse, nuanced understanding of early human history. The theory bridges disciplines, archaeology, linguistics, theology, anthropology, allowing learners to see the Genesis story not only as a religious narrative but also as a historical text with geographic and cultural significance. This interdisciplinary approach promotes critical thinking and encourages people to question assumptions, examine evidence, and consider multiple perspectives. Art, literature, and media are also influenced by this interpretation. For centuries, depictions of Adam and Eve have reflected Western artistic conventions, often ignoring African landscapes, cultures, and peoples. By emphasizing Ethiopia as a central location, artists and writers can reimagine these foundational stories in ways that reflect the historical and geographic diversity of humanity. This reinterpretation has already inspired visual arts, storytelling, and media projects that depict biblical events in African settings, creating a richer, more inclusive narrative. These modern artistic interpretations help audiences connect with the story in new ways, fostering engagement and curiosity about the origins of humanity. The theory also has implications for social and cultural discourse. In a world grappling with questions of representation, identity, and historical inclusion, acknowledging Africa's central role in biblical narratives challenges narratives that have long excluded non-European perspectives. It encourages dialogue about how history has been told and whose voices have been prioritized. This recognition can empower communities to reclaim their heritage, highlighting the importance of including diverse perspectives in discussions about history, culture, and spirituality. By reframing the story of Eve, we are invited to reconsider broader questions about how we understand humanity, belonging, and cultural legacy. Moreover, the Ethiopian Bible's interpretation fosters cross-cultural understanding. By connecting humanity's origins to Africa, it underscores the shared roots of all people, promoting a sense of global unity. Recognizing that the first humans may have emerged from a specific African region reminds us that human history is interconnected, transcending modern borders, cultures, and ethnic divisions. This perspective encourages empathy and appreciation for cultural diversity, showing that our shared origins can serve as a foundation for global cooperation, mutual respect, and understanding. Modern science also intersects with this discussion. Genetic and archaeological evidence consistently points to Africa as the cradle of humanity, supporting the idea that the first humans lived on this continent. The Ethiopian Bible's account resonates with these findings, suggesting that ancient texts and modern science may converge in their understanding of human origins. This alignment between scripture and science can be transformative for those seeking to reconcile faith and empirical knowledge. It demonstrates that religious narratives and scientific inquiry do not have to be in conflict. Instead, they can complement one another, offering a fuller, richer understanding of human history. The discussion also has relevance for modern theology and interfaith dialogue. By situating Eve in Ethiopia, the narrative encourages scholars from different religious traditions to engage with the text in new ways. Judaism, Christianity, and Islam all share stories of Adam and Eve, but interpretations often differ. The Ethiopian perspective introduces a common geographical dimension that can enrich these discussions, promoting mutual understanding and highlighting shared roots. This perspective encourages interfaith dialogue based on historical and cultural awareness, fostering respect for the diversity of interpretations and traditions. Additionally, this theory influences personal spirituality. For individuals exploring their faith, understanding Eve as connected to Ethiopia can deepen the sense of connection to the earth, to humanity, and to a shared history. It reminds believers that sacred narratives are not isolated from the world we inhabit. They are intertwined with landscapes, cultures, and communities. This grounded perspective can inspire a more holistic spirituality, one that honors both the divine and the tangible realities of human life. The Ethiopian Bible also has implications for global conversations about human origins and heritage. In a world increasingly aware of the importance of inclusivity and historical accuracy, highlighting Africa's role in early human history challenges assumptions and broadens our understanding of civilization. It invites a re-evaluation of the sources we trust, the narratives we tell, and the cultural biases that shape our worldview. By reconsidering Eve's origin, we are prompted to examine how knowledge is preserved, transmitted, and interpreted across cultures and generations. Finally, the modern relevance of this theory extends to how we see ourselves as a species. If the first woman emerged from Africa, it reinforces the idea that humanity is a product of shared history, interconnected ecosystems, and diverse cultural legacies. It challenges divisions based on ethnicity or geography and emphasizes the unity of human experience. This perspective encourages a sense of global responsibility, reminding us that the story of humanity is a shared story, one that spans continents, cultures, and millennia. In conclusion, connecting Eve to Ethiopia has profound modern relevance. It reshapes identity, fosters cultural pride, challenges Eurocentric narratives, and encourages interdisciplinary study. It influences art, literature, education, and religious interpretation, while promoting global understanding and reconciliation between faith and science. By situating the story of humanity's first woman in Africa, we gain a richer, more inclusive perspective on history, spirituality, and human origins. This interpretation not only revises our understanding of the past, but also inspires us to think critically, inclusively, and creatively about the shared story of humanity. In the next section, we will bring everything together, summarizing the evidence, interpretations, cultural implications, and modern relevance of Eve's potential connection to Ethiopia, while inviting viewers to reflect on the deeper meaning of this discovery and how it might change the way we see our shared history. In conclusion, the Ethiopian Bible opens a fascinating window into the origins of Eve, linking humanity's first woman to Africa in ways that challenge traditional interpretations and inspire a deeper understanding of history, culture, and faith. If this journey into ancient texts and hidden truths fascinated you, don't forget to like this video, subscribe for more eye-opening discoveries, and share your thoughts in the comments. What do you think about Eve's connection to Ethiopia? Your perspective could spark the next great discussion on the mysteries of our shared human story.